Greetings, hypothetical students, and welcome back to the not-so-hypothetical Victorian literature course. Today we're going to be discussing the presentation of small towns in Middlemarch by George Elliot and Cranford by Elizabeth Gaskell. Before I get started talking about these two books, I do have a few housekeeping things to go through. Firstly, as you may have noticed, this video is quite late. This was supposed to be September and this is now up in October. I have decided that my idea of doing these not-so-hypothetical Victorian literature course videos every 2 months is just unsustainable. One, just because they're a lot of work to film and edit, but also because I don't mind rereading a book every month. I quite enjoy rereading a book every month, but when that book is Middlemarch and it takes up like half my month, that's a lot of my time I'm dedicating to rereading classics, considering how many new books I have that I want to read as well. So what I'm going to do from now on is I'm going to do these videos every 3 months just to space them out a little bit more and to give myself a little bit more time to read the books, especially because I do have quite a lot of hefty Victorian books coming up that I'd like to reread. So the next one of these is going to be in January, and then from then on it will be every 3 months, so January, April, July, October, so on. And I think 4 a year of these is probably fine because they are quite intense. Also, they're quite long, and I also appreciate that if people are going to read the books for them, then that's also a lot of time out of other people's reading as well. So the next video on this, which will be looking at rural communities in Victorian literature, I will be doing in January, and in that I will be looking at Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte and Far from the Madding Crowd by Thomas Hardy, and looking at the way that rural environments and landscapes are explored in them. I will update the Goodreads group with all of this information and send a message round to all the people who are in the Goodreads group. If you're not in the Goodreads group, I'll link it down below. If you don't know what this is, I will also link down below previous videos about this. I really enjoy doing these videos, but I cannot do them every 2 months. It's just a bit too much. I think every 3 months will be much more doable, and hopefully I'll be a bit more on top of that. But anyway, today I'm going to be talking about Middlemarch by George Elliot and Cranford by Elizabeth Gaskell, and how these two books present small towns. As I usually do with these videos, I will quickly first explain a little bit about the plots of these two books and what their basic premise is, and then I will go into my video. The first half of this video will be spoiler free and the second half will be spoilery. I will warn you halfway through. So Middlemarch and Cranford are two very different books, but they both deal with small towns in the Victorian period, or slightly before the Victorian period. Middlemarch is actually set in 1832 and Cranford is set in like the 1830s and 1840s, so again like around the turn from William IV to the Victorian period. Very different books, but both really interestingly explore small towns. Cranford is about a young woman called Mary who regularly goes on visits to the town of Cranford. She visits her friends, the Miss Jenkins, who are part of a community in Cranford of women in their 50s and 60s. The vast majority of people who are respectable, who are ladies slash gentlemen in this town, are all ladies. Everyone in the kind of upper middle classes in Cranford are women, and they all kind of band together and form a really interesting community. The town is very proud of itself, but it's also a town full of gossip and full of kind of small trivial thoughts that take up a lot of space. And one of the things I quite like about Cranford is that on the surface of Cranford a lot of things seem quite trivial, and a lot of the things these characters talk about and the things that give them kind of excitement in their lives seem a bit silly. But the further you get through the book and the more you discover about these characters, you find out so much about them that is the opposite of silly, that is really serious and heartfelt and true and wonderful, and that's one of the things I really like about it. Middlemarch is a little bit more serious in tone than Cranford for the most part. It is about the town of Middlemarch and the surrounding villages and families. It follows a range of characters around Middlemarch, chiefly focusing on 3, I suppose. One is Dorothea, who is a young woman from a very high-class background. We also have a young Dr. Lydgate who comes to this town with so many ideas about what he's going to do to make this town better, to make the medical profession better, and finds the town a little bit more narrow-minded and a little bit more backward than he thought it might be. Then we also follow Fred and Rosamond Vincey, who are siblings. They are the son and daughter of the mayor, Mr. Vincey, who is also a manufacturer. So we follow a lot of different characters and the way that they interact with the town of Middlemarch. Both of these books are highly worth a read. I've read both of them twice and really enjoyed both of them. I prefer Cranford, but Middlemarch is longer, so I will probably talk about them equally today. So I have several things I want to talk about. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about the kind of idea of being a provincial town within Victorian society and what that meant, both the kind of landscape and the detached nature of some of these towns, but also the kind of pride and interest in these towns that exists within these books. I then want to talk about the way that class operates in these small towns, and I then want to talk about the kind of presentation of small towns as being narrow-minded, ignorant, and a bit trivial. That will all be in the spoiler-free section. In the spoilery section, I want to carry on talking a little bit about the kind of narrow-mindedness of these towns, because this is a really important theme here. I then want to talk a bit about gossip gossip and scandal and the way that that operates in small towns in these Victorian books. And finally, I want to move on to talking about the presentation of the kind of kindness and the tight-knit communities of these small towns and how they can be a force for positive things as well as for negative. Because the presentation of small towns is mixed in these two books. I would say in general, Cranford presents a slightly nicer small town than Middlemarch does. Both of them do present places that are sometimes trivial in their concerns and very much eager to gossip and spread scandal. So, let's get into talking about these two books. In terms of the way provincial towns are presented in these two books, I think it's really interesting to look at where these books start from. From the very first page of Cranford, we are being told about Cranford. The first sentence of Cranford is, in the first place, Cranford is in possession of the Amazons. All of the holders of houses above a certain rent are women. The very first thing we get in the book is a statement about what this town is like, and the very first chapter is called Our Society. Middlemarch is quite different though, because although the book is called Middlemarch, like the book of Cranford, it is named after the town, we don't see Middlemarch for quite a while in this book, and actually we start with Dorothea, and for the first like 75 pages we basically exclusively follow Dorothea, who lives in a kind of grand estate with her uncle and her sister outside of Middlemarch, and it's only kind of later that Middlemarch slowly works its way in. And there is this feeling of slight isolation in both of these books. In Cranford we never go outside of Cranford, and although the narrator Mary goes to and from the neighbouring town of Drummle, we almost exclusively see her in Cranford. There are a few chapters in Middlemarch that take place in Rome, but the vast majority of this book does take place in Middlemarch, and I don't think we ever see anywhere else in England apart from Middlemarch and the surrounding areas. I'll talk a bit more later about the kind of narrow-mindedness and backwardness with which these towns are presented, but one theme that is at the heart of both of these books is how detached these places are, the fact that they are provincial towns and that they are far away from the centre of the country. George Elliot's subtitle for Middlemarch was A Study of Provincial Life, and the theme of being provincial is really, really important here. Yet on the other hand, we do get a sense of town pride here. Cranford piqued itself on being an honest and moral town, and one of the reasons why the talented young Dr. Lydgate decides to go to Middlemarch rather than anywhere else to try and implement his medical reforms is that he thinks there is a lot of possibility and potential in somewhere like Middlemarch, but because it doesn't have the same influences over it as London, and because there isn't so much competition, because it will be a place where he can really do good. One, because there's good to be done, and also because it might be more open-minded because it is a small town. That was why I determined not to try anything in London, for a good many years at least. I didn't like what I saw there when I was studying there, so much empty bigwism and obstructive trickery. In the country, people have less pretension to knowledge and are less of companions, but for that reason they affect one's amour propre less. One makes less bad blood and one can follow one's course more quietly. Lydgate's plan for the future is to do good small work for Middlemarch and great work for the world. The idea that this small provincial town can act as a kind of stepping stone to him for the world and as a kind of small contraction of the whole country in which he can implement his medical reforms and try his best to do good work, which might then spread beyond this town. This idea of Middlemarch as a kind of stepping stone. And in that way, Middlemarch is kind of presented as a town that is both separate from the rest of the country and also very much a kind of embodiment of it. I also want to talk a little bit about class. The society we are shown in Cranford is one in which no one is rich but everyone is respectable. These old ladies are all very, very genteel, but none of them have very much money, but they all like to pretend that they have much more money than they have. Their cultural class is different to their economic class, and therefore they have to act in a certain way in which no one ever talks about money, even though everyone knows that none of them have very much of it. And we see sort of similar things with the townsfolk in Middlemarch. For example, a family like the Vinceys, where the father is the mayor, and they are manufacturers, and they have at times had quite a lot of money, but they don't very much at the moment, and yet because they have had that kind of slight lift into a higher economic class, they are therefore now very genteel, and they want to preserve that look of respectability and of sort of upper middle class behaviour even while they can't afford it, so they pretend. Fred Vincey has been sent off to college to become a clergyman. He has a much better education than his father, and one that is really too good for a kind of life that he'll be useful at because he really doesn't want to be a clergyman. Rosamond doesn't really have the money for the kind of life that she wants, but she's very clear that she wants a very kind of high class life. That is what she views as being respectable and what therefore is kind of owed to her. One thing that's very interesting in terms of class in both of these books and in other Victorian novels I've read that deal with small towns is this kind of divide between what are called the county families and the townsfolk. The divide between the families who live in the neighbouring county and have big houses and estates, and the people who live in the towns, who live in streets, who pay rent rather than owning their own houses, or if they own their own houses, own small ones in a street rather than owning a large estate. And this kind of divide between the more middle class townspeople and the more upper class county families is really important in both both of these books. In Cranford, when several of the ladies from Cranford go to see a show where a magician is performing, they pause at the front of the hall and one of the ladies has to ask one of the ushers if any of the county families are going to come before they sit in the first row, because if the county families are coming, then the county families would of course get the first row because they are of a higher priority, being of a higher class. We see a similarly interesting divide within Middlemarch society between townspeople like the Vinceys and county families like the Brookes. Mr. Brooke, Dorothea's uncle, invites Mr. Vincey to his parties because Mr. Vincey is the mayor, but Mr. Vincey is also a manufacturer, so Mr. Brooke doesn't invite his children because he wouldn't like his upper class daughter Dorothea to be associating with Rosamond, who is the daughter of a manufacturer. At one point Dorothea comes and pays a call on Rosamond, and Rosamond is very surprised because to Rosamond, she was one of those county divinities not mixing with Middlemarch mortality. The idea that Dorothea is so far above Rosamond, being from one of the county families, that Rosamond is amazed that Dorothea will even condescend to see her, despite the fact that Dorothea is a lady and Rosamond would also consider herself a lady, but being county and being town is a huge class division within these small towns. The people who live in the town are automatically of a lower class than the people who live in large houses outside. And now I want to move on to talking about the narrow-mindedness, the ignorance and the triviality of these small towns, because this is a big theme in both of these books. In Cranford it is often a comic theme, and Gaskell uses the kind of triviality of the concerns in Cranford to make us laugh with the characters and enjoy the strangeness of their preoccupations. But in Middlemarch it is slightly more damning, I think, in places, and certainly there are several characters in the book who quite look down on Middlemarch, even if they are some that George Elliot presents as being slightly snobbish. It's kind of suggested from pretty early on in Middlemarch that Middlemarch is a kind of boring place, especially for someone like Rosamond Vincey, who has a better education than a lot of people around her and thinks that there are much finer things beyond this small, boring, dull town. She was tired of the faces and figures she had always been used to, the various irregular profiles and gaits and turns of phrases distinguishing those Middlemarch young men whom she'd known as boys. She had been at school with girls of higher position, whose brothers she felt sure it would have been possible for her to be more interested in than these inevitable Middlemarch companions. She says to Lydgate at one point, although it must be said with a little bit of air of digging for compliments, "You will not like us at Middlemarch, I am sure. We are very stupid, and you have been used to something quite different." "I suppose all country towns are pretty much alike," said Lydgate, "but I have always noticed that one believes one's own town to be much more stupid than any other. I have made up my mind to take Middlemarch as it comes, and shall be obliged if the town will take me in the same way." This idea that these small towns, especially people like Rosamond who consider themselves slightly above the small town that they're in, believe that their town is of course the most stupid and the dullest of all, and there is a kind of almost pride in look how stupid the town is but look how great I am, which Rosamond does present a little bit throughout the book. At one point Mr. Brooke refers to Middlemarch as being a little backward, and I will talk in a little bit in the spoilery section of this video about the ways in which Middlemarch's backwardness is presented and explored. We can see a dislike of strangers and of newness in the way that certain characters react towards Lydgate. Rosamond thinks that the town she lives in is full of blunders and busybodies, and Mr. Lydgate finds that every man in Middlemarch apart from Mr. Fairbrother is just a bore, and there is this sense throughout Middlemarch that this town is in some way kind of claustrophobically dull and boring, and that especially for the people who view themselves as slightly above it, it is a narrow-minded and slightly backward place to be. I do also want to mention the ways in which Cranford is presented as this kind of trivial society. There is the idea that in Cranford everyone gossips and talks about everyone else a lot, partly because they have nothing else to talk about. People discuss small, tiny, trivial facts of life when everyone is always concerned for as many opportunities as possible to wear their best clothes. Consider this paragraph for an example. "My next visit to Cranford was in the summer. There had been neither births, deaths nor marriages since I was there last. Everyone lived in the same house and wore pretty much nearly the same well-preserved, old-fashioned clothes. The greatest event was that the Miss Jenkins had purchased a new carpet for the drawing room." And this pretty much sums up the kind of goings-on in Cranford a lot of the time, and the way that a lot of the concerns of these women are presented as being a bit trivial at times, though not under the surface, as I will talk about later. At one point Mattie says, "He used to say the old ladies in town wanted something to talk about, but I don't think they did. They had the St. James Chronicle 3 times a week, just as we have now, and we have plenty to say, and I remember the cackling noise that there always was when some of the ladies got together." Actually, these ladies, with not very much to talk about and not many exciting goings-on, actually get on really perfectly well. It's also presented as being a very tight community where everyone kind of knows everything that's going on, and everyone kind of does the same thing all the time, and there's not much variation. Mary talks about how after living in Cranford for a really short time you soon get to know everyone's routines, and how everyone's routines kind of stay the same. Everyone in Cranford is in bed before 10 o'clock, everyone in Cranford pays calls of no more than 15 minutes, and there are a lot of kind of trivial rules and regulations with which everyone uses to arrange their life and to plan their life. Even the fact that all of the Cranford women are not very rich but don't like to talk about this feels a little bit trivial because they're all making the same pretense at more gentility than they actually have. So now onto the spoilery section of this video. If you have not read both of these books, I would highly recommend that you stop watching now because I am going to be talking about a few more spoilery elements of the plots of these two books. I want to carry on talking about the kind of narrow-mindedness presented as being present in these books, or especially being presented in Middlemarch, because I feel like I've already spoken about it in Cranford and there isn't that much spoilery stuff to do with narrow-mindedness in Cranford, but so much in Middlemarch that I have to say about this. Dr. Lydgate goes to Middlemarch with the full intention of being a really, really good doctor and of making great changes here, but he finds that people don't like his new modern techniques and that people are very sceptical of the way Lydgate works. He does not prescribe medicine for everything because sometimes medicine is not actually the best thing for people. He also carries a stethoscope with him everywhere, and people are very sceptical and unwilling to listen to his judgment when he is so different from other doctors and when he differs in his opinions to so many other doctors. It's because he's a better doctor, but all of them view him with a lot of suspicion because he is new and he is different. He also causes a great scandal by, after the death of one woman, asking to do an autopsy on her body to find out why she died. Mrs. Dollop had become more and more convinced by her own asseveration that Dr. Lydgate meant to let people die in the hospital, if not to poison them, for the sake of cutting them up without saying by your leave or with your leave. For it was known as a fact that he wanted to cut up Mrs. Goby, as respectable a woman as any in Parley Street, who had money in trust before her marriage. A poor tale for a doctor who, if he was good for anything, should know what was the matter with you before you died and not want to pry into your insides after you were gone. The town is very, very narrow-minded against Lydgate's modern medical practices. Lydgate finds trivial about Middlemarch. He also finds the kind of politics and partisan nature of the way interactions work in Middlemarch to be really, really trivial. The way that it matters so much to everyone who he votes for to be the chaplain in the hospital. Small actions towards other people can set other people against you because there is so much bitter, trivial conflict between the people in this town. You have other incidences presented of ignorance, not only the way people talk about Lydgate, but for example when a group of men come and trash the railroad engineering preparations because they really don't want the railways to come to Middlemarch. Very significant, I think, that at the end of Middlemarch a lot of the main characters leave this small trivial town behind. Dorothea and Ladislaw leave, Rosamond and Lydgate leave. There is a bit of an exodus of the main characters at the end of this book, and it seems in a way a happy ending for Dorothea and Ladislaw, and a slightly happier ending, though not completely happy, for Rosamond and Lydgate, that they leave this place that has been in many ways damaging and is so narrow-minded in the presentation of a lot of this book. I now want to talk a bit about gossip and scandal and the role that these two things play in these books, because I think that's something that's really, really interesting. One thing I find again and again in Victorian novels about small towns is the theme of gossip and how small towns are just a hotbed of scandal and gossip and everyone telling everyone anything, how you can have no secrets in these kind of close-knit communities. In Cranford, gossip is described as being like wildfire in the way that it spreads, and we get to see how quickly characters find out different events that are going on in the town. When Lady Glenmire and Mr. Hoggins get engaged, everyone knows about it nearly immediately. Gossip is a huge part of Cranford, and partly because these women don't have that much to talk about, they all give to talking about things about everyone else. But one thing that I do think it's interesting to note is that despite the gossipy nature of many of these women, when it is important to actually keep a secret, for example, later on in the book where they all keep from Mattie the fact that they are doing their best to top up her income, they don't tell her this, and none of them talk about it. And although they are very, very gossipy in many ways, they also know that when they have to keep a secret, they can keep a secret, and that's quite an interesting aspect and juxtaposition in Cranford. Trivialities and things that will be common knowledge soon are perfectly fine for gossip, but actually when something is more serious, the characters don't gossip about it, and that is quite interesting. Slightly less so in Middlemarch, where everything is talked about. News is often dispersed as thoughtlessly and effectively as that pollen which the bees carry off, having no idea how powdery they are when they are buzzing in search of their particular nectar. Fred Vincey's gambling is referred to as being the talk of the town, and Lydgate gets a lot of trash talked about him everywhere. There is a lot of gossip about Lydgate throughout the book, and gossip is in a way very much at the centre of the society within Middlemarch. Everyone is always talking about everyone else, and gossip is even incredibly important for the characters who pretend to be above it. Rosamond is told by her Aunt Harriet that her and Lydgate's relationship is the talk of the town, and Rosamond, although she says the town's talk is of very little consequence, I think is inwardly gratified and really quite happy that everyone's talking about her in Lydgate. And there are two kind of big scandals that take place in Middlemarch that are explored really interestingly in terms of the role of gossip. One is to do with Dorothea and Ladislaw, and there's a lot less gossip about them, partly because Dorothea is from the county families and partly because they don't get together until the very end and we don't quite get to see how everyone talks about it. But the fact that Mr. Casaubon prevents Dorothea from keeping her property if she ever marries Will Ladislaw is obviously quite scandalous, and people are as eager as possible to prevent the gossip and the spread of it, although the knowledge does gradually spread and eventually does get round to Will. The main scandal of the book is to do with Bulstrode and Lydgate, to do with Bulstrode's damaging past, and the fact that Lydgate ends up in some way caught up in the death of a man at Bulstrode's house that Lydgate think is a bit suspicious and kind of doesn't look into, and never really knows whether he didn't look into it more because Bulstrode had just given him a loan or not. It's kind of morally dubious, and that's one of the things that makes it so interesting. And the scandal that follows and the effect on both Bulstrode and Lydgate is really, really important, especially for someone like Lydgate, who didn't do anything technically wrong, who gave the advice to Mr. Bulstrode nursing Raffles, and then Raffles died, and Lydgate doesn't really know anything more about that. The only thing he has done wrong is to not ask more questions. But the scandal and the fact that everyone thinks he has done wrong, and the gossip of this small town, and the judgmental eyes of this place that is so unanonymous. Mr. Vincey says to his sister, Mrs. Bulstrode, "People will talk. Even if a man has been acquitted by a jury, they'll talk and nod and wink, and as far as the world goes, a man might often as well be guilty as not. It's a breakdown blow, and it damages Lydgate as much as Bulstrode. I don't pretend to say what is true. I only wish we had never heard the name of either Bulstrode or Lydgate. You better have been a Vincey all your life, and so had Rosamond." The idea that actually what is worse is the scandal and the gossip more than the potential act of immorality itself. The idea that what is so damaging in these small towns where everyone knows everyone else's business is the scandal and the gossip and what everyone else thinks. So far I've talked quite a lot about the ways in which these books present small towns as being bad things, but I do think that these books are actually much more complicated than that, and although they do present these small towns as being narrow-minded and driven by gossip, they also do present them as being at times a place of kindness, especially in Cranford, but also to a certain extent in Middlemarch, because there are real acts of kindness and affection in Middlemarch. There are a lot of beautiful love stories in here, and there are real moments of sort of friendship and kindliness for your neighbours. For example, if we look at the relationship between Dorothea and Lydgate, who don't know each other very well, but probably could have got on really, really well if they'd have known each other better. I always kind of think that if Dorothea and Lydgate had met each other before either of them got married, they might have made a decent couple, but that's beside the point, because they obviously don't, and I also love Will and Dorothea, even if I don't love Lydgate and Rosamond very much as a couple, because they are terrible together, but that's beside the point. I do think that the kindness with which Dorothea treats Lydgate, and the kindness she does him at the end when she gives him the money, and also when she gives him the money to keep him and Rosamond going, when she goes to see Rosamond to try and sort of clear up their marital problems, and also when she gives money to the hospital to try and help that out. She is so kind to the people around her. In fact, Dorothea is kind throughout the book, and that is one of the things about Middlemarch that I do think makes up for a lot of the harshness in this book, is that Dorothea is kind. She is kind to everyone around her, both when she is at her uncle's house planning better cottages so that the people on their estate can live better, also in the way that she treats her husband, Mr. Casaubon, and also in the way that she treats Lydgate and Rosamond, the way she treats Will. Throughout her life she tries to be kind to other people and kind to her neighbours, even when she doesn't know them very well. Again, you see this in her kindness to Mr. Fairbrother in giving him the situation. She aims to be kind and to try and make life better for other people, and this kind of kindness to your neighbours within this small town is a really, really important aspect of Middlemarch, which does give it a slightly more positive presentation of small towns. Although important to note, of course, that Dorothea is from one of the county families and is not one of the townsfolk. And I do want to talk about the kindness in Cranford. There are acts of kindness throughout this book, but the main thing I want to talk about is the way in which the ladies of Cranford band together to contribute to the salary of Miss Mattie Jenkins after her bank goes bust and she loses all of her money, because although on the surface of things a lot of the dealings and story of Cranford are quite trivial and are to do with small social niceties, we do have a lot of important issues dealt with in Cranford, such as this, in which all of the women who sometimes are presented as being a bit petty really rise to the occasion, and it's really, really moving. Like, these few chapters about this incident in Cranford are really, really beautifully done. Miss Pole says, All of us have agreed that, while we have a superfluity, it is not only a duty, but a pleasure, a true pleasure, Mary, to give what we can to assist her. Miss Matilda Jenkins. I find this section so moving, and the way that these women band together to help Mattie is so utterly beautiful and so kind. Similarly with her servant, who decides it's time to get married and immediately take on a respectable lodger such as her previous mistress in order to try and make Mattie comfortable. Everyone around Miss Mattie, because they love her so dearly, is so kind towards her, and that true feeling of kindness in this book is what makes me love it so much, and what I think is really, really nice about the way it presents this small town, because yes, this small close-knit community know each other's business, yes, sometimes they're irritated with each other, yes, there is some conflict, and yes, there is a lot of gossip, but also they are a community and they look out for each other and they look after each other, and that makes this small town community beautiful in its way. Ever since that day, there has been the old friendly sociability in Cranford society, which I'm thankful for because of my dear Miss Mattie's love of peace and kindliness. We all love Miss Mattie, and somehow I think we are all of us the better when she is near us. So I think that is pretty much everything I wanted to say about Middlemarch and Cranford. I think they both present really interesting portraits of small towns which can be narrow-minded and can be a little bit backward in their sort of claustrophobia, towns which are very close-knit and full of gossip, but also towns in which there are real moments of kindness and affection between neighbours, in which you do get a sense of community, even if it is sometimes a fractured one. Overall, I think Cranford probably presents a more positive depiction of a small town than Middlemarch does, but I do think both of these are really, really interesting books and really interesting examinations of small towns in the Victorian period. Before I go, I do have a few further reading suggestions of some other great books that deal with Victorian small towns. For a few other Elizabeth Gaskell recommendations, her novella Mr. Harrison's Confessions is a brilliant exploration of small towns and of gossip in the Victorian period. Also her novel Wives and Daughters really interestingly looks at a small town, again looks at scandal and gossip within it, but again has moments of real kindness and affection between neighbours, and also looks at the divide between county families and townsfolk. And then I'd also like to recommend two different Victorian series. Barsetshire Chronicles are all set in the same county and some of them in the same town, and books especially like The Warden and Barsetshire Towers really, really interestingly explore the communities in small towns. And then the other is the Cranford Chronicles by Margaret Oliphant, which were partly inspired by the Barsetshire Chronicles and are another series of novels that are slightly interconnected and all set in the same small town. The way that small towns functioned in the Victorian period is a topic that really interests me, and I think that there are so many brilliant Victorian books for exploring this one. So I hope you have all enjoyed today's video. Please let me know down in the comments what your thoughts were, and thank you very much for watching. Hypothetical students are now dismissed.